Thank you for joining us. I am Charles Allen, the traffic analysis lead with the project team. And today I'm happy to review some of the initial traffic and safety analysis conducted so far for the Heber Valley Corridor EIS. Now, first of all, the context of an EIS and how this traffic analysis fits in the overall studies is an important topic to discuss. The whole point of the traffic analysis at this juncture of the study is to establish the existing and future no-build conditions. We establish these conditions to understand the problems and also have a baseline for comparing alternatives. Now, the overall process to arrive at these analysis findings is such. First, we gather traffic data. Then we build traffic models. Next, we analyze traffic conditions. And finally, we report results. Now, this whole process is repeated because we do the very same thing after we generate traffic forecasts for future years. And we'll certainly talk a lot about that later in this presentation. At each of these four steps, there are various tools that we employ in the process to help us conduct the analysis. So before we analyze traffic conditions, we first have to identify what conditions are we designing for. Roadway design is a balance between operations and economic efficiency. If we underbuild, we can experience chronic congestion. I'm sure many of you have driven on a road like this before. Not the ideal situation. Conversely, if we overbuild, we use resources inefficiently. Maybe some of you have driven on a road like this. Also not ideal to build such a large facility that gets underused. Our resources are better devoted elsewhere. So understanding traffic patterns in the Heber Valley helps us select the appropriate analysis period. Here's some traffic data from the gateway highways to the Heber Valley. We have information from US 40 north of town, north of Heber City, US 40 south of town, and also in US 189 to the southwest of town. And this data presents traffic volumes and shows how they vary by time of year and also by day of the week. So as we look at these graphs, we can see that in the summertime, from about May to September, we typically see higher than average traffic volumes. Additionally, throughout the week, traffic volumes are typically lowest on the Monday and then grow each day with the higher volumes on Fridays and Saturdays. Traffic volumes in the Heber Valley also change throughout the day. This is data from various locations in the valley, again, US 40 north of town and south of town and on 189, but also on Heber Main Street. These data show that there's a typical commuter pattern in the Heber Valley, with the highest volumes occurring during the weekday AM and PM peak periods. So most of these charts, you see a spike in the AM and a spike in the PM. The PM peak is usually around 4 to 6 p.m. and is always higher than the AM peak in this set of data. Therefore, the PM peak hour is selected as the analysis time frame for this study. Using the PM peak hour as the analysis time frame is typical for many studies. It's usually the highest hour of the day in just about any location. And that's because though there is rush hour traffic in the AM as well as the PM adds a bunch of other trip types that we typically don't see in the AM hours, such as shopping trips. People don't typically go to the stores too much early in the morning. Another way to think about this is to sort traffic volumes for every hour of the year, all 8,760 hours in the year, in descending order. And here's an example from another highway that shows the typical curve pattern that we'll see when we look at a highway. There's a cluster of very high outlier days on the left-hand side of the graph, and then a descending slope down to zero. So these highest days tend to be outliers, or they represent unusual or extreme events. And then these days far on the right side of the graph tend to be hours that are occurring in the middle of the night over the course of the year. These highest days may have exceptionally high volumes for a number of reasons, sometimes special events or extreme circumstances. And we wouldn't want to design our roads to accommodate these types of traffic volumes if it's an unusual or infrequently occurring event. Think Swiss days in the valley when tons of cars choke the roads, or when I-80 is closed due to a wildfire on a Friday afternoon and all the recreation traffic heads through Provo Canyon. We wouldn't want to design the Heber Valley roads to accommodate those types of traffic volumes. Likewise, we wouldn't want to design roads for the middle of the night traffic because then our roads would be too small, or when there's a fire in Provo Canyon and nobody drives through Heber. The industry practice is to find a balance that captures the typical operating conditions without accommodating some of those one-off days that can be solved or mitigated by other means. Sometimes these extreme events are better handled with temporary police control of traffic. Oftentimes on these curves, we find an inflection point which represents a good balance between accommodating most times of year and economic efficiency. And this inflection point usually correlates with traffic volumes on a typical weekday peak hour. For this study, we've collected traffic data during the summer months to represent a time frame that accommodates most traffic conditions. But we're also focusing on the midweek PM peak to avoid the outlier days that can occur on weekends and holidays. We're going for that time frame that accommodates most hours of the year, but avoids the extreme events. If we've designed the roads in Heber Valley only for average traffic volumes, then as we see on this graph, we'd have horrible conditions for 5 months of the year. Now, back to the type of traffic data that was collected. UDOT performed a data collection analysis in 2019 to collect AM and PM peak hour intersection counts. Every marker on this map represents an intersection that was counted. And this data was counted over 5 days in July and August 2019. About 19 locations in total. Additionally, roadway tube counters were put down at 13 locations for 2 separate periods in July and August. And these tubes record the direction of travel of vehicles driving over them, and also the type and length of those vehicles. These tube counts were counted on major highways and gateways into the valley, and also several north-south streets within Heber City itself, as indicated by the red markers in the middle of the map. In addition, Bluetooth probe sensors were placed at the major entry and exit points to the valley. These sensors used Bluetooth signals to get an understanding of the travel times and the trip patterns of vehicles going through the valley. The sensors would, if it's detected one Bluetooth signal at one location and then detected at another location, then a trip is recorded, and the time difference between those signals being received could be used to approximate a travel time for that particular vehicle. Now, many of you have seen this graphic before. This is a graphic showing the vehicle composition during the PM peak hour on Heber Main Street. It helps us get an understanding of the types of vehicles that occur in the traffic stream. And that's important because different vehicles behave differently. And in order to develop accurate traffic analysis metrics, we need to understand the types of vehicles that are there. Now, one of the key messages that arose from this data is there are quite a few different types of long vehicles driving on Heber Main Street. There's the oil and gas tanker trucks, shown on the far left. There are regular semi-trucks, there are box trucks, and then there are private vehicles that are towing trailers, whether they be work trailers, utility trailers, recreational trailers, or even just longer vehicles that are RVs. If you total up all these different long vehicle types, it's about 8%, 2%, 2%, 2% of the box trucks, 1% of the semis, 1% of the oil and gas tankers. Now, it's important to understand how many of these vehicles we have because they have a significant impact on the traffic stream. One long truck has more impact than one private vehicle. Because it's longer, the truck takes up more space, and it may start and stops more slowly, and it due to its size, it can block sight distance. Now, we know that there were questions about the truck data, specifically the oil and gas tanker truck data. So I want to show you where that data came from. So this is how we determined that number. We actually watched footage from a video camera set up adjacent to the tube counter that was placed on Main Street, about between 300 South and 400 South. We watched the footage and we individually classified every vehicle driving by on Main Street that came into the view of the camera. And we did this for the peak hour, classified every single one of those of the vehicles into those 6 categories that I showed you in the previous image. We also counted all the oil and gas tankers for a 17-hour time period from 5 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. And here's the results of that 17-hour count. This graph shows both the number of oil gas tanker trucks per hour throughout the course of the 17-hour period, in addition to the percent of oil and gas tankers as a percentage of the overall traffic stream. So the number of oil and gas tanker trucks peaks around midday at about 50 to 60 trucks per hour, totaling the entire day, including making some basic assumptions about the number of trucks outside of the 17-hour period that we counted. We estimate about 600 to 700 oil and gas tankers travel through Main Street on a given day. Now, the percentage of oil and gas tankers can get quite large in the early morning hours when there aren't very many other vehicles on the road. Throughout the day, it generally hovers around 2 to 3%. And then in the PM peak period, it gets watered down to around 1%. And this could be due to a number of factors. It could be related to the influx of commuter vehicles that get into the traffic stream during the peak hour. It could also be related to truck drivers avoiding going through Main Street during that time because it's so congested. So we see that whereas midday oil and tanker trucks were about 50 to 60 per hour, during the PM peak were closer to 30. So even though the total number of oil and gas tankers is lower during the peak hour, it is still the most congested time frame overall and is the analysis time frame for this study, because the design that can handle the traffic volumes during the PM peak hour can accommodate the traffic volumes at midday. So this data collection is then processed and summarized into a set of PM peak hour turning movement volumes at key intersections. So here are the volumes for all the traffic signals on Heber Main Street. This data, in turn, gets fed into a traffic microsimulation model. In this case, a microsimulation model using a software platform called vSim was used to help us analyze the network on a vehicle-by-vehicle basis, and using the existing configuration of the street system and the existing signal timing. And all of that information was pulled together and extracted from the simulation model to help us develop measures of effectiveness, or MOE, ways to describe how well the traffic system is operating. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it congested? Are there trouble spots? Are there areas where it's easy to move through the system? All that came from this microsimulation model. It models vehicles individually as they drive through the network, react to traffic signals, react to other vehicles, change lanes to prepare to turn, to head towards their destination, etc. Here's a summary of some of those results from the traffic simulation model. These traffic conditions are reported as a level of service. Level service is a concept of describing traffic operations on an A to F letter scale, which correlates with the amount of delay experienced by drivers. Level service A represents a very little delay, and level service E and F represents heavy delays. It's also what we consider a failure of the traffic system. Whenever we see a level E or F, we describe that as failure, where there's lots of delays and traffic stream breakdowns. Generally, level service D is the threshold between acceptable and operations and failure. And so in most planning and design exercises, we want to achieve level service D or better. So this graphic on the left reports the level service for the PM peak hour for signalized intersections, which is indicated by the letter inside the circle at each of the intersections. And intersection level service is computed from the average vehicle delay. So if you average the delay experienced by all vehicles approaching the intersection on all 4 of the legs, that average correlates to the level of service. So sometimes you can get very little delay on the less busy approaches to an intersection, which can water down the overall average. So there might be a lot of congestion on some of the major legs, but that could be offset by the little minimal delay on other legs. So that's why we also look at level service for the arterial. So arterial level service, rather than looking at the average for an intersection, is a representation of the average speed on an arterial between 2 points. So our arterial level service in this graphic is represented by the colored arrows, and the average speeds for that segment are annotated next to those arrows. So for current conditions, average speeds on main streets are generally between 20 and 30 miles per hour, except for a few instances, starting at around 100 north down through 100 south in the southbound direction. We have a poor level of service. Average speeds drop to around 11 miles an hour. And northbound, there's also a poor level of service between 100 south and Center Street going northbound. The tight spacing of the traffic signals in this area is a big contributor to the slow speeds and the poor level of service. In addition to level of service, the traffic model is used to measure average travel times over the course of the PM peak hour. These graphics show the average travel time for beginning and end points through the network. And this average travel time includes the vehicle running time, the acceleration and deceleration times, congestion, waiting at traffic signals, etc. So in downtown Heber, the average travel time southbound is about 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and the average, which correlates to about an average speed of 20 miles per hour overall. For northbound vehicles to get through town, it takes about 4 minutes. And the entire trip from SR 32 all the way through town down to the 189 intersection is around 8 minutes. And that's pretty similar heading both northbound and southbound. In addition to travel time and level service, our simulation model also helped us understand how much queuing occurs in the network. Queuing means how much vehicles stack up as they wait to get through an intersection. The most significant queuing is southbound at the 100 south. And the combined queues from the 100 south and Center Street signals stretch back several blocks in the network. Otherwise, the queues for many of the other intersections and approaches are not too bad. Okay, so I talked about gathering data, building models, analyzing conditions, and reporting results. Now here's the part where we repeat all of that for future conditions. So to understand future conditions, we need to understand how much growth is going to occur. And that starts with looking at the population and employment projections for the Heber Valley. This graph shows those projections. These are developed by state and federal agencies, and then we incorporate them into our work to turn these population and employment figures into traffic projections. Now, these are the standard projections that are used for transportation planning, as well as other fields of study. As seen in this graph, there's quite a bit of growth anticipated to occur in the Heber Valley between now and the year 2050. So, how do we convert population growth into traffic forecasts? How much traffic is the expected growth going to bring to Heber Valley? The primary tool that we use to develop traffic forecasts is called a travel demand model. Now, the underlying principle in a travel demand model is People plus jobs equals trips. If you have people who live in one area and there's jobs in another area, then we predict that there's going to be trips between those two areas. And a travel demand model splits a study area into defined geographies or zones. And in each zone, there's an assigned number of people and jobs, depending on the characteristics of that area. So for example, we have zone A with a population of 500 people. And if there's zone B with 200 jobs, then there will be a demand for travel between the zones. So the travel demand model will take that information into account and calculate the number of trips expected between those two zones. Now, the travel demand model also considers the different paths that are available to get from one zone to another. So supposing that this first route between zones A and B, though it's shorter, it may start to get very congested. And in that case, the model makes a proportional assignment to another route, which might be a little bit longer in distance, but if it's less congested, it offers perhaps a competitive travel time. Okay, now in most communities, there's more than one zone with jobs. So a travel demand model takes into account the relative amount of employment in different zones and the distance between zones and assigns those trips proportionally. Also, if we add some population to zone B, now we'll have trips flowing both ways. In fact, most zones have some amount of population and jobs. So there's always trips going multiple ways. And the travel demand model takes that into account as it makes predictions about where travel is occurring. A model quickly becomes very complex. Many travel demand models have hundreds or even thousands of zones, depending on their size. For this project, a travel demand model built for the Wasatch and Summit counties was utilized. This model was developed in 2020 by Mountain Land Association of Governments and UDOT staff. What we're looking at is the zone structure of the Heber Valley portion of the model. Each green shape that you see represents a specific area and the number of jobs and population within that geography. So if you kind of squint at it, you can start to pick out, maybe recognize some of the key features in the Heber Valley. You might see some of the where some major roads are occurring. The existing population and employment for each zone is derived through census data and other local sources. The 2050 population and employment projections are derived from state planning sources, such as the Kempsey C. Gardner Policy Institute and the University of Utah. Then model developers meet with the local governments. They take those projections derived by the Kempsey C. Gardner Policy Institute and other sources, and then meet with local governments, such as counties and cities, to refine the distribution of population and employment and the expected growth within the various zones in the model, taking into account local plans and predictions. So on top of the zones is a representation of the roadway network. Here's a screenshot of the road network for the Heber Valley portion of the travel demand model. This view is a little bit easier to get your bearings and pick out where some of the major roads are and get a sense for where things are. Here's where downtown Heber is. Here's the representation of US 40. Here's the representation of US 189 heading out towards Deer Creek, midways over in this area. So once a travel demand between zones, all the zones in the model is computed, then the model loads trips onto the road network depending on the available paths between the origin and destination and the travel times of those paths. And then the model iterates over and over again, each time recalculating the travel times as trips jump from one path to another. It's similar to the way that you try out different routes when you're discovering an area for the first time. Eventually, the model reaches a stable convergence where there isn't much change from one iteration to another. And then the model completes its work and reports out the total number of trips on each link or roadway segment in the model. For this study, our modeling work was vetted by staff at UDOT as well as MAG, the Mountain Land Association of Governments. And we also performed a calibration process where we ran a model with existing population and employment numbers to see how well the model matches up with actual traffic counts. So here's a summary of the 2050 volumes as reported by the travel demand model. This is a no-build model. And what that means is all planned projects are assumed to be completed in the future year, except for the project in question. And that's a requirement of the NEPA process, where you have to have the no build so that you can test whether a project is really needed. So in this case, we've assumed all planned future projects are completed. That includes things like an interchange at US 40 and SR 32, widening of US 40 south of town, some widening of SR 113 between Heber and Midway. But any form of a bypass is assumed to not be built. That way we can test this no build or no action condition. So what we see is that traffic volumes in downtown Heber in 2050 are expected to be about 38,000 vehicles per day. That grows slightly north of town to 40,000, and then the legs south of town on US 40 and US 189 are about 16,000 and 29,000 vehicles per day, respectively. Another way to look at this is to draw a screen line and total all the traffic crossing that screen line. So the figure on the right illustrates that. The screen line is this red dashed line cutting across town. And if we take the travel demand model and count every single time a vehicle crosses that red line, then we come up with our screen line volume total. And what that shows us is that for current conditions, there's about 45,000 vehicles per day that go north-south across that line in Heber City. Now, 65% of that traffic moves north-south on Main Street. Looking forward to 2050, that total north-south traffic volume grows to about 63,000 vehicles per day. But again, the majority of that is trying to travel on Main Street, about 60%. So the total growth on Main Street is about, from existing to 2050, is about a 30% growth. So that's an important point to remember as we look more into future conditions. So I mentioned that the Heber Summit County model was new, finished up in early this year. And because it's new, we wanted to compare it to other forecasts to vet its results. So UDOT maintains another travel demand model that encompasses the entire state of Utah. It's called the Utah State Travel Model, or USTM. Now, it's much coarser, but it offers a little bit better perspective of regional traffic flow through the Heber Valley. In addition to that, you can take a look at historic traffic volumes and plot a trend line from historic volumes to give you a look at the historic growth projected into the future. And that's what this graph compares, is we have the historic growth projection, we have the statewide travel model prediction, and we also have our Heber Valley model that we used so far in this project, all projected out to the year 2050. And the Heber Valley model fits right in between the historic growth projection and the statewide travel model. So we feel good that it's in line with other sources of predicted traffic volumes. Each one of these of prediction sources correlates to about a growth of about 1% per year. Now, again, we've created a projection of future travel demand for the no action condition in 2050. And just like with existing, we take the PM data, the traffic volumes predicted for the PM peak hour, and we load them into our VSIM traffic simulation model. And then again, traffic performance metrics are developed from that simulation model. So here's a comparison of the existing and 2050 no action PM peak hour traffic metrics side by side. On the left is current conditions, and on the right is our 2050 no action scenario. So whereas all of our intersection level service was level service C or B for existing conditions, every one of those degrades to a level service E or F by 2050. Likewise, average travel speeds on Main Street also degrade in several places. We see that the southbound level service starts to get much worse, and the failure occurs not just between 100 South and 100 North, but stretches all the way back to 500 North. Likewise, a few of the other locations start to degrade a little bit from 20 miles an hour of average speed down into the teens. And the 2050 no-build congestion is also represented by increases in travel times. Southbound travel, in particular through downtown, increases quite a bit for 2050 conditions. It increases by 60% from we had about 4.5 minutes going through town to now in excess of 7 minutes. The 500 North intersection is a huge bottleneck and contributor to these slow travel times. Southbound travel times between SR 32 and 5th North more than double by 2050 because so much traffic is trying to get into and through downtown Heber City. See more of that on this next slide, which talks about queuing. So here's the queuing for current and 2050 no action conditions. In 2050, southbound queues are nearly continuous from 100 South back to 500 North. And then queues from 500 North stretch about 2.5 miles upstream, heading through the valley towards SR 32. Likewise, there's quite a bit of congestion and queuing on eastbound 100 South. Right here, queues are expected to grow longer than 2,500 feet. So all these metrics indicate that the transportation system has a hard time handling the predicted demand for 2050. Here's a comparison of the travel times all the way through the valley from SR 32 through town and then along US 189 over towards the turnoff to Midway at SR 113. And in the southbound direction, travel times grow from 13 minutes over 22 minutes. Not as much increase seen in the northbound direction because that's the direction, the off-peak direction of travel, as we say. Fewer people heading northbound than southbound during the PM peak. Now, some of you have been involved in previous studies in the Heber area over the years. Most recently was the study completed in 2019. So you may be asking, well, how do these traffic volumes and results compare with that study? We have a summary table here, but first, one thing we have to remember is that counting traffic and reporting volumes is it's like taking your temperature. You might get 98.4 degrees today, 98.9 degrees tomorrow, 97.2 the next day, because your temperature changes throughout the day, depending on what you've eaten or what thermometer you use or where you take the temperature. The important question is, are you above a fever stage, which is about 100.4 degrees? So with this understanding, the existing volumes and the 2050 no-build volumes from these two efforts, 2019 and our current study, are virtually the same. We've got around 30,000 vehicles per day on Heber Main Street for existing conditions, and then in 2050, no action or no build scenario, that grows to about 38 or 39,000. Now here's a comparison of the Main Street PM peak hour traffic analysis results between the two studies. On the left is from the 2019 study, and on the right is from the current effort. One thing to keep in mind is even though the overall methods are similar between the two studies, this study is going to take analysis to a higher level of detail. So while the previous study didn't go into as much detail, this one's taking it further. So we expect to have a little bit different results as we use a little bit better magnifying glass for this effort. So either way, the big picture is that the results between the two efforts are very similar. The overall message is consistent that by 2050, we're definitely at a fever stage. If there are some traffic flow concerns on Main Street today with 29 to 30,000 vehicles per day, then it's only going to exacerbate when traffic volumes grow by about 30% for 2050. So moving on to the safety analysis. We examined crash statistics in several ways in the Heber Valley. The first step was to take a look at the overall crash frequency. What you're looking at here is a crash cluster map or heat map of crash frequencies in downtown. The red colors represent a higher frequency of crashes, while the blue, cooler colors represent a lower frequency of crashes. And in an image like this, you can start to see where the most crashes occur. There's three primary hotspots at the 100 South intersection area, 600 South intersection area, and finally the US 189 intersection area. In addition to look at crash frequencies, we isolated specific crash types. These are the fatal and serious injury crashes. Crash severity is reported on a 5-category scale, with fatal crashes and serious injury crashes being the two highest severity categories. And these are the two categories that UDOT usually focuses on when looking at the safety analysis. So seen from the map, there are two small clusters on the north end of US 40. There are about 6 total fatal and serious injury crashes. 3 of these were drowsy driving crashes, and there were also several head-on crashes. And UDOT has, it should be noted, UDOT has a pending project to install median rumble strips in this area. And that's expected to have an effect at helping to reduce crashes. We also isolated the pedestrian involved and bicyclist involved crashes, as shown in this map. Now there's a few dots that are close to Main Street, but they don't actually occur on Main Street itself. There's only about 4 crashes that occurred on Main Street that involved a pedestrian and cyclist. All 3 of the bicycle involved crashes involved a cyclist being hit in a crosswalk or in a driveway. And this may be indicative of the unfriendliness of cycling on Main Street itself, as bicyclists appear to be choosing, in this case at least, these cyclists were choosing not to ride in the street, but were instead on sidewalks and going across crosswalks. In addition to that, we looked at the crashes involving commercial motor vehicles, as shown in this map. We isolated these crashes and mapped them and to understand where these are occurring. Now keep in mind, just because a crash involved a commercial motor vehicle doesn't necessarily identify which of the vehicles involved was at fault. To provide more context for how these crash frequencies and locations compare to the state and to other cities, we took a look at the crash rates. A crash rate is take the number of crashes that occur and divide it by the traffic volume, as well as the roadway length for a given area. And that way you can compare different areas by accounting for the differences in volumes and length that may occur. So the crash rates in downtown Heber City on Main Street were compared to main streets in 3 other communities: Vernal, Moab, and Logan. And this was done to pick communities of similar sizes that also may have a significant amount of truck traffic. Vernal is also on US 40, experiences much of the same truck traffic that occurs through Heber City. Moab is on US 191. It's also a major freight route. And then we have Logan, which has somewhat of a similar downtown configuration as Heber in a few ways. And that's on Highway US 91. So looking at the rates, the crash rate for all crashes, Heber's crash rate is 4.21, which is higher than the statewide average for other roadways of similar size and traffic volume. That statewide average is 3.81. So it's a little bit higher. It's also higher than Vernal's crash rate, but lower than Moab's and Logan's. Likewise, the severe crash rate, Heber's is 5.7, which is lower than the statewide average. Heber's severe crash rate is higher than the other 3 communities, but again, all of them fall below the average for the state as a whole. And lastly, we looked at the crash rate for commercial motor vehicles. Heber's rate is about 0.38. That's 0.38 commercial motor vehicle crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. And Heber's falls about in the middle of the pack when comparing Vernal, Moab, and Logan. So overall, the Safety analysis presented several metrics, but none of these metrics stand out as showing a severe or extreme crash problem in the Heber area. So today we've gone over several things. We've talked about the data collected for traffic analysis, how that analysis was performed, and looked at several of the metrics from that analysis for existing conditions and our 2050 no action conditions. And we've also taken a look at some of the safety data. I want to thank you for your interest. We look forward to your continued involvement in this study. And for more information on the project, please visit the project website at hebervalleyeis.udot.utah.gov.